A 18-year-old woman buried alive by her own parents, and a man who hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks found her by accident. This isn't just a story of survival. It's about healing, trust, and what happens when two broken people find something worth staying alive for. This is his story, and hers. The last of the storm had finally broken, leaving the air heavy and the ground slick with mud. I was Warren Holt, a rancher on the edge of 41, and most folks knew my name but few dared to use it. My spread was big, and my silence bigger. I walked the fence line along the creek at dawn, my boots squelching in the churned earth, checking for downed sections. It was the kind of morning that still felt like night, with the sky a bruised purple, but I had a rhythm, and the storm hadn't changed it. I usually kept an eye out for coyotes or a stray calf near the creek bank. This patch of land was mostly dense thicket and scraggly oaks, not good for much. But as I passed a cluster of elderberry bushes, something caught my eye. The soil there looked wrong. It wasn't just wet or disturbed by rain. It was like someone had been digging, hard, then trying to smooth it over. There were no cattle here, no graves that I knew of. I walked closer, my steps slowing. At first I told myself it was just erosion, maybe a tree had fallen and pulled up earth. But then I saw it, a small patch of torn blue fabric, like a scrap of old dress, sticking out of the fresh earth. It was almost buried, barely visible, but the color seemed too bright, too out of place against the muted browns and greens. A knot formed in my stomach. I knelt down, the cold mud seeping through my trousers. I started to dig with my hands. The earth was cold, packed tight, but soft enough from the rain to give. I dug around the fabric, pulling away handfuls of mud and wet leaves. My fingers brushed against something hard, then something softer, like roots, but too regular. A shiver went through me that had nothing to do with the damp morning air. I kept digging, pushing aside the heavy dirt, and then I saw them. Small fingers, curled slightly, covered in mud. They were cold, gray, and barely twitched. My breath hitched, a sharp, quick thing in my chest. I dug faster, harder now, scooping away the packed earth. I uncovered a small wrist, then an arm, then a shoulder. It was an 18-year-old woman, buried head down, her body small and still beneath the earth. Her mouth was packed with what looked like an old, dirty rag, jammed in so tight it distorted her lips. Her eyes were swollen shut, dark and bruised. She was barely alive, just a shallow breath, a faint pulse against my thumb when I checked her neck. There was no sound from me, no shout, just a quiet, stunned kind of movement. I worked quickly, carefully, digging her out, feeling the coldness of her skin, the weight of her small frame. When she was free, I lifted her gently, carrying her against my chest. She was lighter than a bale of hay. I carried her back to the cabin, the mud caking my boots, the chill of her skin seeping through my shirt. Inside, I laid her on my cot by the hearth. She didn't speak, didn't open her eyes. She just breathed, a faint, ragged sound. I wrapped her in my thickest wool blanket and stoked the fire. Then I just waited. The sun was fully up now, but the cabin felt dark. The first 24 hours were a stretch of quiet watching. I cleaned the mud from her skin, gently, trying to be careful around the bruises that showed on her face and arms. Her hair, matted with dirt, was a dark, dull brown. I poured water into a tin cup, then dipped my finger in it, bringing drops to her lips. She sucked them in, slowly, almost like a baby bird. I kept at it, every hour, watching her throat move. She lay there still, barely moving, just taking in the water, her breathing soft and shallow. I sat beside her the whole time, a rifle resting across my lap, watching the light shift through the cabin window. Her hands were small but calloused, the knuckles thick. They were scarred too, old wounds that had healed badly. I saw the faint white lines around her wrists. Marks that weren't new, not from the dirt, but from something long-term, something that had held her. Restraints, I figured. It was a cruel thing to see. I tried to guess her age. She was small for her size, but her features were sharp, too defined for a child. 15, maybe 16. Young enough to still be a child, old enough to know what was happening to her. I thought about the sheriff, about riding into town, but I knew the law here. They didn't have much patience for kids who showed up out of nowhere, especially not ones found half buried. They'd ask questions, declare her an orphan, or a runaway, and then send her off to some workhouse or foster family, where she'd likely disappear again, just in a different kind of way. Or worse, if they heard the stories already buzzing about strange 18-year-old woman and curses. No, that wasn't an option. Not for her. "You're staying for now," I muttered, the words feeling foreign in the quiet cabin. She didn't stir, didn't react, just lay there, a small, still lump under the blanket. I didn't know what else to say, what else to do. I found a piece of paper and a pencil, laid them on the small table next to the cot. Maybe she could write, maybe she could tell me her name. She didn't touch them, didn't move much at all, unless I helped her shift, or brought water. That night, after the sun had gone down, and the cabin was lit only by the fire, I heard a soft rustling. I looked up from my chair. She was standing by the door, a small shadow in the dim light. Her steps were quiet, almost soundless. She reached out, her hand small and hesitant, and slid the bolt home. The soft click echoed in the room. Then she walked back to the cot and lay down, pulling the wool blanket up to her chin. She didn't look at me, just locked the door herself. Days turned into a week, then another. The 18-year-old woman started to explore, cautious at first, then with a quiet determination. She never went far. Not more than a few feet from the cabin walls, as if an invisible rope tethered her. I'd watch her from the porch as I cleaned my rifle or carved a new handle for my axe. She'd walk the perimeter of the small yard, tracing paths in the dirt with her bare feet, her head tilted, observing. One afternoon I saw her stoop by the old trash pit, a collection of ash and charred wood where I occasionally burned papers or broken tools. It wasn't a place anyone lingered. She picked something up. It was a doll's head, made of chipped porcelain, blackened on one side from some old fire. Its eyes were empty sockets, its hair gone. It was a disturbing thing, but she didn't flinch, didn't drop it. She just held it, turning it over in her hands, her fingers tracing the cracks in its face. Then she placed it carefully on the edge of the pit and walked away. I hadn't called her anything. It felt wrong to just invent a name, but the silence started to weigh on me. I saw the calendar in the barn, the one from last year, still hanging crooked. It was open to June. "June," I said one morning, setting a plate of flapjacks on the table. She looked up, her eyes wide, then slowly, hesitantly, she reached for the syrup. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. After that, I just kept using it. "June, the axe needs sharpening. June, eggs need collecting." She started to respond in small ways. A slight nod, a turn of her head, a shift of her weight towards me. When I handed her the basket of eggs one morning, fresh from the coop, she took it with both hands. Her fingers were careful. She didn't just dump them into a bowl. She looked at each one, turning it over as if checking for cracks or imperfections, before placing it gently on the counter. It was a precise movement, almost ritualistic. I noticed other things. When she was out by the chicken coop, feeding the birds, I'd hear a faint sound. It wasn't a song, not really. It was more like a low hum, a soft, breathy sound that was almost a vibration. She wasn't humming a tune. She was just making a noise, a steady rhythmic sound, as if she was mimicking the quiet life of the hens, trying to match their clucks and soft movements. It was like she was trying to blend in, to become part of the living world around her. She wasn't just existing, she was trying to echo the pulse of life itself. A new thunderstorm rolled in one afternoon, heavy and dark, the kind that shook the windows and made the horses skittish. The sky turned sickly green, and the first fat drops of rain splattered against the glass. I figured June would be frightened. Most people were, especially after a long, dry spell. I watched her from the kitchen as the wind picked up, waiting for her to move closer to the fire, or maybe to cower in a corner. Instead, she did the opposite. She walked to the door, opened it, and stepped straight out into the pelting rain. She didn't run. She didn't flinch at the cold water. She just stood there, arms loose at her sides, her face turned up to the sky, letting the rain soak her clothes, her hair, her eyes. When I saw them from the doorway, were calm, unblinking, as if she felt nothing at all. It was unsettling, almost unnatural. I went out after her, pulling my coat tighter against the sudden chill. She was already walking towards the creek, her boots sinking into the soft mud. I found her standing by the bank, the water churning brown and fast, swollen from the downpour. She just watched it, her expression blank, the rain plastering her hair to her face. Then slowly, deliberately, she knelt in the mud at the creek's edge. She extended a finger, not caring about the dirt, and began to draw. She didn't look at me, didn't seem to know I was there. She drew a shape, a simple outline of a cabin, small and boxy. Then, behind it, she drew a jagged circle, a pit, and inside the pit, two small stick figures. A man and a woman, indistinct, but clearly human. And then, at the bottom of the pit, another small shape, a stick figure that was clearly her, curled up, almost swallowed by the lines of the pit. It was a stark, wordless picture. She was showing me. It was all there, laid out in the mud, the cabin, the pit, the two people, and herself. The knowledge settled in my gut, cold and heavy. I didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. I just stood there, my hand gripping the fence post beside me, until my knuckles ached, watching the rain wash away the edges of her story, leaving only the memory of what she had shown. A few days later, I needed supplies. I hitched up the wagon and drove to the general store, the kind of place where dust never quite settled, and everyone knew everyone's business. I picked up a spool of heavy thread for patching canvas, a sack of flour, and a new tin cup. Mine had a leak. While I was at the counter, old Mrs. Gable was talking to Silas, the storekeeper. Their voices were low, but the words carried in the close space. "Heard it from Widow Perkins, just last week," Mrs. Gable whispered, her voice like a dry rustle of leaves. "That preacher and his wife, 2 towns over, buried their own daughter, they did. Said she was possessed. Cursed, wild, they called her. Claimed the good Lord told them to put her in the earth for her soul." Silas just grunted, nodding slow. "Heard something similar. Shameful business. But some folks, they just ain't right in the head when it comes to God's word." My hand tightened on the tin cup. I said nothing. Just paid Silas, my eyes fixed on his ledger. But the words had already settled, cold and hard in my bones. It fit too well. The silence, the marks on her wrists, the dirt in her mouth. It all clicked into place with their low whispers. The tension set into my shoulders, a stiff, unyielding knot that lasted all the way home. When I pulled the wagon into the yard, June was sitting on the porch step, just watching the horizon. She looked up as I got down, her eyes quick and assessing. I didn't say anything to her, didn't have to. She knew something had shifted. She was a quiet creature, but she picked up on things. On the way, the air changed around me. That night, after supper, I went to the old trunk in the corner of the cabin. It held a few things from my father, things I rarely touched. At the bottom, wrapped in a faded cloth, was his Bible. It was thick, heavy, with cracked leather covers. He'd read from it every night, loud and booming. I carried it to the hearth, stoked the embers until they glowed red-hot. Then, without a word, I opened the Bible and placed it, page by page, into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and then burst into orange. The smell of burning paper filled the cabin. I didn't explain. I just sat there, watching it burn, the heat on my face. June sat beside me, her small silhouette against the firelight, watching the flames consume the pages. She didn't ask why. She just sat. I started showing June things. Not talking, just showing. There was plenty to do on the ranch, things that needed doing right. First, I showed her how to boil horse liniment. I led her through the steps, how to gather the comfrey and arnica from the lower meadow, how to bruise the leaves just so, mix them with lard and turpentine in the old iron pot, stirring slow over a low fire. She watched my hands, then copied them exactly, her movements precise and quick. Next was the tack, saddles, bridles, worn leather that needed care. I showed her how to work the saddle soap into the dark leather, how to buff it with a soft cloth until it gleamed. She learned fast, too fast, almost. It was like she'd been taught hard labor her whole life, but maybe never been taught trust. She absorbed everything, every flick of my wrist, every angle of the brush. Hooves were next, trimming them, checking for stones or cracks. I showed her how to lift a horse's leg, how to steady it between her knees, how to use the nippers. Her hands, though small, were strong, steady. She had a way with the horses, a quiet confidence that settled them. They didn't shy away from her. We developed our own way of talking, simple hand signals at first. A flat hand meant stop. A raised palm meant wait. A circling finger meant walk around. She adapted quickly, surprising me with how fast she picked them up and even started inventing a few of her own. She'd tap her wrist for time or point to her mouth for hungry. It made things easier, a silent language understood only between us. I built her a small bed in the pantry, a narrow space off the kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was private. I hauled in fresh pine straw for the mattress, layering it thick, and found a soft wool quilt to cover it. She'd carry her few things in there each night, and each night, before she went to sleep, she'd take a piece of chalk and draw small shapes on the wall next to her bed. A sun, a simple circle with rays. A tree, just a trunk and a few branches, and then a sleeping face, a round outline with closed eyes. She didn't write words, but the pictures were clear enough. She was making her own quiet world on the pantry wall. I knew it was only a matter of time before someone saw her. The ranch was big but not invisible. Sure enough, old man Peterson, who ran his cattle along the south fence line, spotted June one morning. She was walking the perimeter, checking for breaks, just like I had taught her. He stopped his horse, stared a long time, then rode off in a hurry. Within a few days, the whispers started. I heard them when I went into town for grain, just hushed tones behind market stalls. "Isn't that the feral 18-year-old woman?" someone would ask. Another voice, lower, would reply, "Thought she was dead. Heard her folks buried her." They didn't say much else to my face, but the air around me turned colder. Then Widow Barnes, a sharp-tongued woman from the church, stopped me outside the general store. She didn't whisper. "That child you're keeping," she said, her voice like a rusted gate. "A devil's child, I hear. You ought to send her back to wherever she crawled from, Holt. She'll bring nothing but misfortune." I just looked at her, then walked past. What could I say? That night, a rock came through my barn window. It wasn't a big rock, but it cracked the pane clean through and landed with a clatter in the hay. I walked out and picked it up. It was smooth, river stone. Not a message, just a threat. I didn't retaliate. There was no point. It would just make things worse. I just swept up the broken glass. When I came back into the cabin, June was sitting up, her eyes wide. She'd heard it. I didn't need to explain. That night, I moved her bed. I didn't say anything, just dismantled the pine straw and quilt from the pantry and set it up in the small room next to mine. It was closer to the main room, closer to me. If something happened, she'd be safer there. She watched me, then quietly moved her chalk drawings from the pantry wall to the new room. She just started tracing the sun, the tree, the sleeping face, on her new wall. One of Warren's calves fell ill that spring. A small, wobbly thing, barely a month old. It started foaming at the mouth, unable to keep anything down. It lay there, panting, its eyes dull. I'd seen it before, a sickness that usually took them fast. I tried what I knew, but the calf just worsened. June walked over to it, quiet as always. I watched her kneel beside the struggling animal. She didn't flinch from the foam or the smell. She just knelt close to its head. She started to breathe with it, a low, steady exhale and inhale, mimicking its shallow gasps. She gathered some leaves from the yard, things I hadn't noticed her looking at before. She crushed them in her hand. Then, gently, she pressed the pulpy herbs into the calf's gums. She did this for what felt like hours, just breathing with the calf, pressing the herbs, occasionally stroking its soft flank. By sunrise, the calf was up, not running, but standing. It took a few wobbly steps, then found its mother, nudging her for milk. The foam was gone. Its eyes were brighter. I didn't ask her how she did it. There was no point. I saw what she did. It was enough. The next day, word came to the ranch. Silas, the storekeeper, sent his boy, young Thomas, on horseback. His youngest son had a fever, high and unbreaking. They'd tried everything. As Thomas spoke, I noticed June was gone. She wasn't by the barn, wasn't in the yard. I had no idea where she'd gone. I told Thomas I'd ride into town, but I didn't know what I could do. Hours later, June returned. Her boots were caked with mud, dark earth clinging to the leather. She walked straight into the cabin, carrying a handful of weeds. I recognized some of them. Feverfew, its small white flowers drooping, and the dark green leaves of willow bark. She walked past me, straight to the kitchen table, and started to sort them. She looked tired, but her eyes held a steady light. She just had mud on her feet, and the plants in her hand. It was a cold, clear night, the kind where the moon was sharp and the stars seemed impossibly bright. I was outside, checking the latches on the barn, when I heard the horses. A low rumble at first, then the distinct sound of many hooves approaching. They weren't riding fast, not like they were in a hurry, but deliberately. I saw them when they rounded the bend in the road, a group of townsfolk, about a dozen men, some on horseback, some walking. They carried torches, not lit yet, but held tight in their hands, their unlit wicks stark against the night sky. The preacher was at the front, his face grim, his jaw set. "Halt," he called out, his voice carrying unnaturally loud in the still air. "We've come for the 18-year-old woman. She's a witch, a devil. 18-year-old woman, bringing sickness and misfortune. You're harboring evil." His words were like stones, hard and unyielding. I stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. The rifle was already over my shoulder, the familiar weight a comfort. I didn't take it off, didn't raise it, just let it rest there. "She's under my roof," I said, my voice low, steady, cutting through the night. "That makes her mine." It was a simple statement, a declaration of possession, not of property, but of protection. My gaze swept over the men, one by one. I saw the uncertainty in their eyes, the way their hands tightened on the unlit torches. They hadn't expected me to be so firm, so calm. June was at the window, a small shadow against the faint light of the cabin. She did not cower. She didn't press herself against the wall or try to hide. She just watched them. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, taking in every face, every movement. She wasn't afraid. She was observing. The mob hesitated. The preacher's words faltered. A strong gust of wind howled down from the mountains, whipping around us, rustling the dry leaves on the ground. No one dared to light their torches. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to back away, turning their horses, their footsteps retreating back down the road. The night was quiet again, save for the wind. That winter was a harsh one. The snow piled high against the cabin walls, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. We spent most days inside, tending the fire, making repairs, cleaning tools. It was during those long, quiet days that June started on something. She gathered old scraps of fabric, a piece of my worn-out denim shirt, a faded flour sack, a swatch of my mother's old curtain material I'd never thrown out. She didn't say what she was doing, just worked, her small hands busy with needle and thread. By the time the thaw came, she was done. It was a cloak, made for me. A heavy, warm thing, crudely stitched, but surprisingly well made. And on the back she'd stitched in flowers. Little bursts of color, oddly shaped but clear enough. Yellow ones, blue ones, green stems. I unfolded it, surprised. "Why the flowers?" I asked, my voice rough. She didn't speak. She just placed one hand over her chest, right where her heart would be. It was a simple gesture, but it held more meaning than any words. Our bond deepened in those quiet days, a slow, steady thing. Long days of work beside each other, mending fences, repairing equipment, clearing fallen timber. Silent meals by the fire, the only sound the crackle of wood. And on clear nights, we'd sit side by side on the porch, looking up at the stars, the silence between us comfortable, not empty. She began to teach me a kind of sign language, an extension of the signals we'd started. Some of it was invented, simple gestures for objects or actions, but some felt like they were remembered. Ancient signs, perhaps from her past, a language only she knew. She'd draw shapes in the air, or trace them on her palm. Slowly, clumsily, I started to learn. My fingers felt thick and slow, but I tried. One night, after she'd watched me struggling with a particularly stubborn latch, she signed a word for me. She moved her hands, a slow, gentle gesture, and then she touched her chest. It was a word I didn't know. When I looked at her, questioning, she signed it again, slowly, then tapped my arm. "Safe," she signed. Her word for safe. It meant me. The freeze came early and bit hard that year. One evening, word spread through the scattered ranches like wildfire. A town boy, young Caleb Miller, had gone missing. He'd gone out to check his father's traps and hadn't returned. People searched for hours, through the woods, along the frozen river. No luck. The cold was setting in, and everyone knew what that meant for a lost child. I didn't volunteer to help. I rarely did for town matters. My presence usually just made folks nervous. But June, she just walked out the door. I saw her from the window. She walked to the edge of the woods, not towards the river where everyone else was searching, but deeper into the silent trees. She paused at the tree line, then knelt. She placed her hand on the frozen soil, holding it there for a long moment, as if listening to something beneath the earth. Then she started walking. Not running, not searching wildly, just walking, a steady, unhurried pace, her head tilted, as if following an invisible thread. A few of the townspeople, still desperate, saw her. They didn't know what she was doing, but they followed, drawn by something they couldn't name. I watched them disappear into the shadows of the pines. They found him. He was half submerged in an old abandoned well, hidden deep in a thicket no one remembered. He was alive, barely, shaking violently, covered in ice, but breathing. They pulled him out, wrapping him in coats, shouting his name. June was standing at the edge of the well, her face impassive. The townspeople stared at her now. Not with fear, not with anger, but differently. There was awe in their eyes, and uncertainty. A raw, disquieting respect. They were still afraid, maybe, but it was a different kind of fear. It took me the better part of the spring, working whenever I had a spare moment, but I finished it. I built June her own room. It was off the main living space, a small addition to the cabin, sturdy and snug. I chose the lumber carefully, planed each board smooth. I made sure there was a proper window, bigger than the others, letting in plenty of light. I even painted the window frame a soft, calming blue, a color that reminded me of the clear sky after a long storm. And on the inside, I installed a small iron lock, one she could throw herself. When it was done, I showed her. She walked in, slowly, touching the smooth walls, running her hand along the blue frame. She looked at the small cot I'd built into the corner, the pine straw mattress, the quilt already laid out. She stood there for a long moment, her back to me. Then her shoulders started to shake, softly at first, then harder, and then she wept. It wasn't a loud, dramatic cry. It was quiet, deep, wrenching sobs, the kind that tear through a person from the inside. I didn't comfort her with words. There were no words for this kind of pain, this kind of release. I just sat down on the floor by the doorway, my back against the wall, and waited. I listened to the sound of her quiet, broken weeping, the first tears I'd ever seen her shed. I stayed there until the last of the sobs had subsided, until her breathing quieted. She turned then, her face red and swollen, but her eyes were clear. She raised her hands, still trembling slightly, and signed to me. The gestures were slow, deliberate. "This feels like," she signed, her fingers moving, never leaving. My heart tightened in my chest. I nodded, just once. "That's the point," I signed back, my fingers clumsy but firm. I hoped she understood. A fire broke out in a neighbor's barn a few weeks later. Old Man Hawkins. His entire hay supply went up in smoke. Nobody knew how it started, but the whispers, they started right away. People remembered June. They remembered the sick calf, the lost boy found by a miracle, and now a barn burning down. It had to be her. "The devil's work," I heard them say. I rode into town the next morning, not for supplies, but to the small gathering hall. I demanded a hearing, not for me, but for her. The town gathered, a nervous, expectant crowd. The preacher was there, of course, standing at the front, righteous and stern. He started right away, pointing at June, who stood beside me, quiet, composed. "She brings misfortune," he declared, his voice booming. "A curse on this town, a witch 18-year-old woman sent to test our faith." June walked forward then, slowly, deliberately. She didn't look at the preacher, didn't respond to his words. She just walked right up to him, close enough to reach out. The crowd fell silent, watching, holding their breath. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and placed it in the preacher's trembling hand. It was a drawing, a simple charcoal sketch, but perfectly clear. It showed the preacher, his face contorted with anger, his arm raised, and beneath his arm, cowering, was his son, a small, terrified figure, visible through the outline of the church's back wall. The crowd gasped. The preacher's face went white. He stammered, his booming voice suddenly gone, replaced by a choked sound. He looked from the drawing to his son, who stood wide-eyed in the crowd, then back to June. The truth hung heavy in the silence, undeniable. I said nothing. I didn't have to. The drawing spoke for itself. The fire was forgotten. The next morning, June did something she hadn't done since I found her. She walked to the small table where I kept my papers and ink. For the first time she asked for paper. She didn't sign it, didn't point. She looked at me, then at the paper, then back at me. A clear request. I handed her a clean sheet and a pencil. She took it, her hand steady. She bent over the paper, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then slowly, carefully, she wrote a single word. My eyes followed the movement of her pencil. M-A-R-A. Mara. I read aloud, the sound of it strange in the quiet room. I knew the word. It meant bitter in an old tongue her mother had once spoken, a language I'd heard snippets of from traveling traders. It was the name she'd been given, the name that had defined her. I looked at the word. It was a name steeped in pain, in all she had suffered. It was the name of the 18-year-old woman buried alive. I looked at her small, determined face. Then, without a word, I tore the paper cleanly in half. Not in anger, but in a deliberate motion. I crumpled the pieces. I reached for a fresh sheet, smooth and clean, and handed it to her. She looked at the blank paper, then back at me, a question in her eyes. I just nodded. She understood. She took the new paper, hesitated for a moment, then bent her head again. This time she wrote slowly, forming each letter with care, as if each stroke was an act of creation. Juniper. Juniper. My breath caught in my throat. It was the name I had given her, the name of a wild, resilient plant that thrived in harsh ground. But now, it was her own. It was the first thing she had ever chosen for herself. Years passed. The ranch grew, not in size but in purpose. The cabin, once a lonely outpost, felt lived in, warm. I was older now, my hair grayer, my hands more gnarled, but there was a light in my eyes that hadn't been there before. The ranch had become a place of quiet healing, a refuge. Kids from town started coming to the ranch, not for gossip, not for fear. They came to learn. They would gather around the corrals, their young faces eager, listening to Miss Juniper. She didn't speak much, still. Her voice was a rare, precious thing, but her eyes taught everything. They watched her, their small hands mimicking her gentle way with the horses, her calm touch with a sick lamb. She showed them how to tend to the animals, how to read their quiet needs, how to be patient and kind in a world that often wasn't. She taught them without words, through action and presence, and they understood her better than they understood most adults. I would sit on the porch, watching her, a quiet pride blooming in my chest. She was a different person now, not the small, bruised thing I'd dug from the earth. She was whole. She was strong. She was Juniper. One evening, after the last of the children had left and the sun was setting in streaks of orange and purple, she came to sit beside me on the porch swing. The air was cool, smelling of pine and damp earth. She didn't speak. She just reached out, her hand warm and firm, and touched my arm. Then, slowly, she raised her hands, forming the signs we had learned together, the language we shared. "You saved me," she signed. Her eyes, quiet and deep, held a lifetime of gratitude. I looked at her, then out at the land, at the long shadows stretching across the fields. I raised my own hands, my fingers stiff, but I made the shapes carefully. "You saved yourself," I signed back. My gaze met hers. I just kept the door open,